in 1780 to a prestigious Long Island family, Seabury Treadwell was a descendant of Episcopal Bishop Samuel Seabury. Treadwell married Eliza Parker in 1820 and had 7 children, 5 girls and 2 boys, over the next 15 years before retiring in 1835. Despite his success as a businessman, Treadwell was not well known outside of his community. Joseph Brewster, a hat maker and speculative real estate developer, bought 2 land lots in 1831 for $6,550, equivalent to $187,000 in 2023. On one of them, he built a townhouse at 29 East 4th Street. The architectural writer Donald Reynolds wrote that Brewster finished the house in April 1832 and lived there for 3 years. Gertrude, her 2 brothers, and her 5 sisters lived with their parents. After the second youngest daughter, Sarah, was severely injured in a stagecoach accident in the 1850s, a hand-pulled elevator was installed to bring Sarah to her bedroom, and the staircase to the 3rd floor was rebuilt. Only 3 of the Treadwells' children married and moved out of the house. 4 daughters and 1 son never married. Eliza Treadwell died in 1882, followed by the siblings' unmarried brother in 1884. By then, many of their wealthy neighbors were moving away. The New York Times and the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation indicate that it was not known why the family remained, but the Toronto Star wrote that the Treadwells were too poor to move uptown. The unmarried sisters Julia, Phoebe, Sarah, and Gertrude remained in the house as spinsters. They gradually upgraded the furniture, although the sisters wished to retain the furnishings as Papa wanted it. With no income, the sisters subsisted on their father's estate, selling off land in Brooklyn and New Jersey as money became scarcer. Sarah eventually moved to the Cadillac Hotel near Times Square, where she died in 1906, leaving just Phoebe, Julia, and Gertrude at the house. According to Seabury Treadwell's great-nephew George Chapman, the family was not a friendly lot. By 1909, 3 of the remaining sisters had died. Gertrude, the only surviving sister, had become a recluse after her father forbade her from marrying a Roman Catholic physician. She hired a maid to greet her few visitors. She had a conflict with the Consolidated Gas Company, which had allowed the Treadwells to pay their gas bill less often. According to the New York Herald Tribune, a young and inexperienced bill collector cut off Gertrude's gas in the mistaken belief that the family had not paid their bill. A gas company director went to apologize, but Gertrude refused to talk to him after an hour. Due to her worsening health, Gertrude remained in her 2nd-floor bedroom throughout the 1910s and 1920s, while one of her nephews moved to the 3rd floor. They mostly lived in the house and went to Lake Champlain for a few weeks every year. In her final years, Gertrude had to sell her belongings and take out a mortgage on her home. Despite this, she kept the house in its original condition long after all the neighboring private homes had been demolished or converted. After her nephew died in 1930, Gertrude rarely had visitors, and she died alone in one of the 2nd-floor bedrooms in 1933. The New York Times wrote that she had died as a gentle, well-bred recluse hemmed in by ugliness, and she had been forgotten. The house was unoccupied for several years. Eliza Nichols, daughter of Gertrude's oldest sister Elizabeth, wanted to pay off the house's mortgage by selling the structure and its contents. George Chapman bought the building, saving it from foreclosure and demolition. According to the New York Times, Chapman bought it the night before the house and its furnishings were to go on public auction. The group gave a special event for the museum on May 8, 1936 and opened it 3 days later on May 11. Beginning at 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. The same month, the New York State Education Department installed a plaque commemorating Seabury Treadwell's residence. The same year, the Historic American Buildings Survey took many photos of the house, and Columbia University's Avery Architectural and Fine Arts Library exhibited photos of the interiors. The Historic Landmark Society launched a fundraising campaign, and at the time, the group spent $3,500 yearly to manage the museum, but its 50-cent entry price and 2,500 annual visitors were not enough. Chapman warned that the house was in danger of being sold. He paid off the mortgage and continued to run the house as a museum. The museum's caretakers, married couple Harry Lundberg and Florence Helm, lived in the basement until Helm's death in 1954. The museum attracted 1,000 visitors annually by 1950. The next year, the Historic Landmark Society's Board of Directors convened to discuss the endowment fund, which had grown to $25,000 but was still short of its goal. The Boston-based Hale Foundation promised to donate $45,000 if the museum's operators were able to match the donation, but this did not happen. Consolidated Edison installed a gas heating system in the museum in 1955. By the early 1960s, the house was in very poor condition and needed $200,000 in repairs. According to architectural critic Ada Louise Huxtable, the house was so weak that a severe storm could potentially destroy the plaster ceilings, and the original furnishings were ready to crumble on a touch. The museum still did not have enough visitors to finance its own operation. Museum officials had unsuccessfully attempted to obtain funding from private donors, and Randolph Jack, its curator, was personally paying for the museum's upkeep. After Jack suggested selling the house and its contents to raise money in early 1965, the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, LPC, called it a document of great importance for its authenticity but had no legal authority to preserve it. Preservationists petitioned federal and state officials to protect the house as a landmark, and 100 children protested its sale. The Decorators Club expressed interest in restoring the house, and the museum was closed for some restoration work in August 1968. The club hired Joseph Roberto, an architect at nearby New York University, to consult on waterproofing issues. The club had raised $5,000 at the time, all of which was used to restore the house. Roberto wrote several letters to officials asking them to fund the house's restoration, but Huxtable wrote about it in 1970, bringing attention to the project. The New York City government and the New York State Historic Trust provided initial funding for the renovation in 1970. The Robertos, along with 6 other people, were named museum trustees. Structural and exterior work began in 1972 and was completed in 3 phases. The project involved rebuilding the foundation, replacing more than 2,500 bricks along the party walls, and replacing the S1 carpet had to be replaced due to its tattered condition. Restoration workers examined several layers of paint before restoring the walls to their original off-white color. Lighting fixtures and cast iron railings were also restored. At the time of the renovation, the city landmark designation only extended to the exterior, so there were concerns that the house's interior could be significantly altered during the renovation. The city was in the midst of a severe fiscal crisis, leading the Christian Science Monitor to describe the renovation as a bright spot in these sad times for New York City. The first floor reopened in November 1979, and the museum received an additional $70,000 in donations to refurbish the second floor. Museum officials held a Christmas party in 1980 to mark the completion of the second floor renovation. The project had cost $280,000, funded by over 24 donors. At the time, museum officials planned to spend another $100,000 to restore the kitchen and bedrooms. The same year, Joseph Roberto received a Certificate of Merit from the Municipal Art Society for his work on the house's restoration. The Robertos continued to work in an office at the front of the house. The New York Times wrote in 1987, "The house is very much alive these days with its occasional use for special events and celebrations." The owner of 3 small buildings just east of the Seabury Treadwell House, at 31-2, opened the basement, first, and second floors to the public on Sunday afternoons and allowed groups to book appointments during weekdays. After the demolition of these buildings the following year, the house suffered $1 million in damage. The lack of a retaining wall to the east caused a crack along the length of the house, and the interiors suffered water damage. When Joseph Roberto died in 1988, the museum began searching for new staff. In April 1990, the museum hired several staff members, including Executive Director Margaret Halsey Gardner. The museum spent $600,000 to stabilize the house, according to Gardner. The sculptor David Flaherty was hired to restore the interior plaster work, and Jan Herd Picorni was hired to research the house's history and architecture as part of the museum's master plan. As New York City tourism numbers fluctuated, the museum hosted tours of the neighborhood to raise funds. By the 2010s, 40 volunteers ran the museum, which had 15,000 annual visitors. The neighborhood had become a fashionable residential area. If the structure were still a dwelling, the Wall Street Journal estimated it might sell for $6 million in 2018. The LPC reviewed Caladop 2 Park Corporation's 2012 proposal for an 8-story hotel west of the house because it could affect the house's structural integrity. The hotel's developers promised not to damage the museum and that the new building would structurally reinforce the museum. Gardner submitted a petition to the New York Supreme Court in early 2018, claiming that the New York City Department of City Planning had approved the hotel project based on erroneous information from Caladop. Gardner claimed that the hotel's construction could cause the house to collapse, and museum officials put up signs warning that the museum could be bankrupted by increasing legal costs. Gardner formally sued the DCP and Caladop in mid-2018 and a subcommittee of the New York City Council voted against the hotel plans that September. Caladop then sued to reverse the City Council's decision, claiming that they planned to ensure that the house would not be damaged. The developer filed new plans for the hotel in late 2020, but the LPC delayed a decision over these plans because of concerns over the house's structural integrity. When the hotel was approved in late 2023, Gardner said that vibrations from construction could cause irreparable damage and threatened to sue. As the dispute over the adjacent hotel development continued, NYC Parks was planning to renovate the Seabury Treadwell House for $3.2 million starting in late 2024.